I was sitting in my car in front of the building. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. It's 3 o'clock in the morning and I still don't dare to get out of the car. There is only one question in my mind. What am I doing here near this abandoned police station? I turn my head to the glove box, where there is an old voice recorder found among my brother's belongings. I remember his last words before disappearing. "You have to find this place. They want you to come." The recorder started working by itself. His old tape started spinning even though I never turned it on. A loud metallic screech filled the interior of the car. I peered into the darkness trying to figure out what that sound was and why I felt cold. But I found the answer on the cassette, my brother's voice, broken, weak. "If you hear this, then I'm already dead." The words broke off, but I already knew that I would not be able to stop. I slowly got out of the car, feeling something invisible pulling me inside the abandoned building. The feeling of being watched was so real that I almost screamed. The abandoned police station stood dark as death, as if waiting for me with the door open. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The darkness embraced me like an old friend. There was silence inside, but not the kind of silence that soothes, but the silence that hides sinister secrets. The air was thick and saturated with something rotten. My eyes gradually got used to the darkness. Directly in front of me was a long room with rows of tables and scattered papers. Suddenly there was a sound in the corner. I turned sharply, seeing something flash in the darkness. Only for a moment did I see it, a distorted face where eyes should have been, gaping dark voids. It was like an inferno that had sprung from another world. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and tried to light the room. The beam of the lantern snatched the old filing cabinet out of the darkness. Its door swayed even though there was no wind. I slowly moved closer. Something inside this closet twitched and tugged as if it wanted to break free. I stopped. The door swung open, blasting me in the face with cold air. An old police badge fell out of the cupboard, and a piece of paper with my name written in blood on it. I stood there, paralyzed with fear. Something stirred again in the closet, like the deep moans and cries of a child coming from inside. I was shaking. I knew I had to look there, but my mind told me that it might be my last act. However, something told me that I could no longer retreat. Suddenly, heavy steps were heard in the corridor behind me. I turned around, but all I saw was darkness. The footsteps came closer and I realized they weren't alone. There were several. Hundreds of footsteps echoed as they approached me, and every one of them was as heavy as a stone rolling into hell. I realized they knew I was here, and they didn't want me to leave alive. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Further, the sequel will be more confusing and scary with each new step. The main character will encounter manifestations of the incomprehensible and terrible, which makes him doubt his sanity, and the secrets of the abandoned station will only unfold further, revealing more and more frightening and dark details. The darkness seemed alive. The footsteps were getting closer and I could feel the floor shaking under my feet. I realized that I needed to move. Grabbing my phone, I rushed to the corridor, choosing a random direction, but the footsteps kept up. They were everywhere, behind me, in front of me, from the sides. It was the sound of hundreds of feet approaching. Suddenly, a heavy door leading to the basement appeared in front of me. Without thinking, I rushed towards them and slammed them shut behind me when I heard something massive hit the door from the other side. I found myself in a dark, damp basement. The weak light of the phone illuminated almost nothing, but I could see the stone walls hung with old shelves. On some of them there were old newspapers, documents and bottles with something that had long gone moldy. I noticed a staircase in the depths of the basement and started towards it, trying to muffle the sound of my steps. It seemed to me that every movement I made here could be heard whispering. Barely perceptible but indistinct. They were fragments of words, phrases, as if someone cursed me from the other side of reality. He started to climb the stairs when he suddenly smelled the sharp smell of burnt leather. Stopped, checking if something was on fire. But no, it was something else. At the top of the stairs I saw a slight flicker of light like a candle. When he got closer, he noticed a small room lit by several candles. There was a filing cabinet on the floor, from which someone had obviously taken documents. And suddenly I saw him. A dark figure standing with his back to me. He was wearing a police uniform, but the uniform looked old, almost rotten. A tall, thin man stood motionless, holding a folder in his hand as if studying something. I took a step back, trying to hide, but a piece of glass crunched under my foot. The figure sharply turned its head in my direction. I saw his face. It was distorted, as if burned, with peeling skin and empty eyes. He was looking directly at me, but as if through me. He opened his mouth, and from his throat came a cry like the groan of 1,000 dead. The shock wave forced the air out of my lungs and I fell to the floor, covering my ears, trying not to go crazy with the sound. Suddenly everything fell silent. I raised my head, there was no figure. But the folder he was holding was now in front of me. I couldn't help but come closer. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside were old photographs. I recognized my brother on one of them. A young, smiling man in a police uniform. He was standing near the same building. I turned the pages further and saw pictures of other people who had disappeared. They all had one thing in common. They were all employees of this station. The last photo stopped me in my tracks. It was me. Taken from a distance just as I was standing in front of the building today. I felt my hair stand on end. Suddenly, a cold breath passed down my neck. I slowly turned around. Behind me stood the same figure, but now he was closer. I could smell his breath, the smell of death coming from him. His mouth slowly opened and he whispered, "You're next." I don't remember how I got out of the basement. I only remember running, stumbling, randomly looking for a way out. The building began to change, corridors became longer, rooms changed shape. I heard screams and moans, saw reflections of broken people in the windows. It was a hell into which I had fallen and from which there was no way out. But I ran, I wasn't going to give up until I heard her. Laughter. Children's laughter. It echoed from the corridor ahead. And in the darkness I saw a small figure of a girl. She was standing holding a doll. Her eyes were black, bottomless like night. And she spoke in a soft, almost affectionate voice. "Don't worry, they just want to play." I froze looking at the girl. Her smile was eerie and her eyes showed nothing but emptiness. Laughter echoed around me as if it came not from her lips, but from the very walls. I felt my heart beat faster, my palms became wet with sweat. My brain was screaming to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. The girl slowly walked towards me, the doll in her hands seemed alive. Her eyes were as empty as a child's. I took a step back, but she took a step forward. Her face was changing, becoming older, uglier with each step. "Play with me." Her voice sounded hard now, like the crunch of ice underfoot. I realized that the only thing I could do was turn away and run. And I ran, trying to find a way out of this maze. The walls began to shrink, the light flickered as if light bulbs had burned out one after another. I did not know where I was running, but my legs did not stop. I heard a child's laughter behind me, mocking and ominous, and I felt something cold touch my shoulders. Suddenly I fell to the floor, feeling a great pain in my leg. The flashlight slipped from my hands and rolled to the side, illuminating the huge room where I found myself. It was an old archive room where police files were once kept. Cabinets were scattered, papers were flying in the air, as if from a strong wind. I tried to get up, but my leg wouldn't obey. At that moment, I heard the door creak softly behind me. They slowly opened, as if under the influence of an invisible force. And then I saw them. There were many of them, a dozen, maybe more. Figures in police uniforms, with distorted faces, without eyes, with dark voids instead. They stood and looked at me as if they were expecting something. Their hands were stretched forward as if they wanted to grab me. They moved slowly but steadily, closing the distance between us. My hand was shaking as I fumbled for my phone and tried to turn on the flashlight. I shined the light on the figure, hoping it would scare them away. But they did not stop. I realized that they are not afraid of light. They were part of this darkness, part of this place. I began to babble, keeping my eyes on the approaching ghosts. And suddenly he saw the door on the left, half open. I rushed to them, pressed the handle with all my might and rushed inside, closing the door in front of the figures themselves. Fortunately, the door was locked. I heard them scratching at the door from the other side as if trying to get in. The space I entered was much smaller. A small office with 2 desks and computers that looked like they hadn't been used in decades. I slowly walked around the room trying to find something that could help me. He noticed an old phone in the corner. He picked up the phone and pressed the button. There was a beep. I called 911, but there was no answer. And then the phone rang in my hand. I could barely contain his surprise. The voice on the other end of the line was low and hoarse, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here. They can see you." I wanted to ask who it was, but the connection was cut. The handset slipped from my hands. There was a rumble from outside, someone or something hitting the door so hard that it rattled. I understood that they would not last long. He looked around for a way out and saw the ventilation hatch above the table. Without thinking, I climbed onto the table, tore off the ventilation cover and crawled inside. The ventilation was cramped and dirty, but I had no choice. I moved forward, trying to ignore the claustrophobia that gripped my heart. And then I heard him again. Laughter of a girl. It echoed right in front of me from the depths of the ventilation passage. All my instincts were screaming to stop, but I knew there was no other way out. I continued to move forward, trying to breathe calmly. The light on the phone was fading and I realized that the battery was about to die. And just then, when I was in complete darkness, I heard her voice right next to my ear. "We are close, don't run away." I had the feeling that the ventilation was getting tighter and tighter, as if the walls were starting to narrow around me. I could feel my breathing getting heavier and my heart pounding so loudly I thought I could hear it pounding across the room. But the most frightening thing was the thought of what would happen when the phone was completely discharged. The light was dim and I could only see a few inches in front of me. I tried not to think about the girl's laughter, which was getting closer and closer. Suddenly, a light flicker appeared in the passage ahead, like a slowly moving shadow. I stopped, trying not to breathe. In the darkness I heard a faint whisper of speech, but I could not understand the words. It was like some kind of incantation or prayer, very ancient and ominous. I slowly crept forward when I noticed something ahead, a hatch that led down. Without thinking, I pushed him with all my might. The hatch gave way and I fell down into a small room filled with old monitors that flashed green and red lights. It was some sort of control center, apparently once used to monitor this building. I got to my feet and saw an old control panel covered in dust and cobwebs. A red record button was flashing on one of the monitors. I clicked on it and suddenly a video appeared on the screen. It was a recording from one of the security cameras in the corridor of the same building. I saw myself in the video. The moment I went inside, determined to find answers. But there was something behind me. Something I didn't see then. A dark figure lurking in the shadows. Another recording started playing on another monitor. Now I could see a room with a large chart on the wall where pictures of missing people were posted. I saw familiar faces, my brother, other policemen. And among them, my own. But in my photo there were red crosses over the eyes, as if someone had crossed them out, like in an old newspaper. I felt goosebumps on my skin. A new recording has started on the third monitor. I saw the door of this very control center and something was approaching it. I turned to look at the door behind me but there was nothing there. Turning back to the monitor, I saw the door on the screen slowly open. A shadow began to appear from the darkness. First, only her outline and then her face. The face was distorted, as if twisted by an invisible flame. The eyes were completely black and the mouth opened in a terrible grimace. I heard a slight creak behind me and turned around. The doors really started to open. I froze in horror when a soft whisper came from the darkness. "You know, we've always been here, we've always been waiting for you." My head was spinning and I realized that something completely impossible was happening. The walls of the room began to move as if they were breathing. I heard the children's laughter coming from the ventilation shaft again. This time it was even louder, as if multiplying in an echo. I felt like I was losing my mind. We had to find a way out before it was too late. Suddenly, a loud crack was heard behind him, and all the monitors began to flash, as if some kind of obstacle had begun to appear on them. I saw brief frames of my brother's face, his scream, the girl's smeared face, the door opening, and my own fear again. Suddenly everything stopped. Darkness covered the room, and I heard a voice right next to my ear. "You know you're not getting out of here." I did the last thing I could. I rushed to the door, tore it off the hinges and ran out into the corridor that seemed endless. I didn't stop, I just ran, trying to escape from the voices, from the laughter, from the figures that appeared from the shadows. And suddenly I saw the light. A small ray of daylight filtered through a crack in the wall. I rushed to him, realizing that this might be the only chance for salvation. Pushing with my whole body, I began to widen the crack, feeling the light penetrate more and more. But when I finally managed to knock out part of the wall, all I could see was another room similar to the one I had just escaped from. And the brother's voice was already coming from that room. "Did you really think you could get out? We're all here, forever." I found myself in a new room, but it was already something completely different. The walls here were plastered with mirrors, and the floor was made of dirty, cracked tiles that looked as if they were 100 years old. Mirrors reflected me from all sides. I could feel them sucking me and pulling me into their depths. Somewhere far in the reflection I saw movement. Something dark darted across the corner of my vision, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. In the mirror I saw my face, but it looked strangely distorted. The eyes were empty, without color shades, only two black hollows in which small figures seemed to move. My imprint slowly began to move closer to me regardless of my movements. It wasn't me. Something else was in the mirror. Something that had my face but wasn't me. It stopped when the distance between us became less than a meter. I saw how it smiled, and its smile stretched up to the ears, so unnatural that the blood froze in the veins. "Do you know why you're here?" he said quietly, ominously, the echoes rolling around the room. I couldn't take my eyes off. It continued, "You came because this is your place. Your destiny. Everyone else you seek has already found their purpose here. Now it's your turn." I felt the mirrored walls begin to shift, shrinking around me. The room seemed alive, its surface pulsating like a living organism breathing and looking at me with its thousands of eyes. The prints kept coming from all directions. Suddenly I saw my brother's face among them. It screamed, but I heard no sound, only saw its mouth open in silent terror. Then it disappeared, replaced by the face of a girl with empty eyes and a smile that was just as sinister. I screamed, trying to smash the mirror with my fist. The glass did not yield. My hand was painfully numb from the impact, but the mirror remained intact, as if it was not just a glass surface, but something unbreakable, something that was fueled by my fear. Then I tried another mirror and another, but to no avail. Each blow only intensified the echo of laughter that rolled around like an ominous chorus. I saw a door at the far end of the room. The only way out. I rushed towards them, but each step was harder. It felt like the floor was spreading under my feet, pulling me back. I finally reached the door, but as I took hold of the handle, I felt a terrible cold that pierced my body to the bone. I pushed the handle, but the door wouldn't open. I tugged at it again and suddenly felt a hand touch my shoulder. I turned around and saw that behind me was the same figure as in the mirror, but now it was real. Her face was almost touching mine. It was empty like a mask, only this mask moved and breathed. "This is the end of the road," it whispered. "You can't go back. You can't escape." I threw myself at the door again, this time with all my might. They opened and I fell into another room. But now I was in the dark. Complete, absolute darkness, in which not a single ray of light could be seen. I heard whispers around me, faint at first but growing louder. They were voices. Many voices overlapping each other, as if many people were speaking at the same time. I didn't understand the words, but they sounded angry and wary. Suddenly I felt something lick my ear. I recoiled but saw nothing. The laughter came again, but now it was coming from inside my head. He was filling me up from the inside, tearing my thoughts apart. And then in the darkness, I saw red eyes that burned with hatred. They appeared from everywhere. They didn't blink, didn't turn away, they just looked at me with hatred and hunger. I heard a whisper that was closer than before. "This is all yours," said the voice, familiar and terrifying. My brother, he stood in the darkness, his face pale, his eyes empty, and he held out his hand to me. "It's all yours if you stay." The darkness began to shrink. I knew that if I stayed here even a moment longer, I would be dragged forever. I lunged forward, flailing my arms, trying to find walls or something to hold on to. But my hands passed through the void as if I were swimming in a black ocean. And then I saw a little ray of light, small as a needle in a fog. I rushed to him, realizing that this might be my last chance. The light expanded, became larger. I reached it, burst through this tunnel of light with all my might. I got out. My feet touched the hard surface. I found myself on an old road in front of an abandoned police station. I was breathing heavily, trying to comprehend what had happened. But when I looked around, I realized that it was not quite the same road. The trees around were dry and rotten, the sky was gray and dead, and the station seemed to be just waiting for me. I heard the familiar laughter of a child behind me and realized that it was starting again. "This is just the beginning," the voice whispered, and I knew there would be no escape, asterisk asterisk asterisk. I stood on the dead road, panting in panic, but the cold air cut my lungs like a knife. Something changed when I left the building. The trees around me were as bleak as the sky, their branches like curved arms reaching towards me. The police station was still in front of me, but now it seemed taller, darker, and even scarier than before. I didn't know if he had changed or if I had. I started backing away, trying to keep the station in sight. And suddenly he noticed movement from the side of the road. Figure. Did someone approach me? At first I thought it was a man, but the closer he got, the clearer it became that it wasn't. His silhouette was blurred, like in an old picture, with faded outlines and empty eyes that glowed in the dark. I wanted to scream, but the sound got stuck in my throat. The stranger stopped a few steps away from me. His face looked like a photograph yellowed by time, with traces of old scars and bruises. He looked at me with blank eyes and his lips slowly stretched into a predatory smile. "You should have come a long time ago," he said in a voice that sounded like a broken radio. I felt the chill go down to my bones. "They are waiting for you. All of them." I saw how other figures began to appear around him. They emerged from the fog, each looking old but familiar. I recognized some of the photos I saw in the building. They were all here, missing policemen, missing people. Their faces were contorted in horror, as if they were trapped in their own nightmare. They began to move toward me, reaching out their hands as if to touch me, but their movements were slow and broken, like an old clockwork. "Stay with us," said the first man again, his voice louder, more confident. "You must stay. This place has what you were looking for. Answers." I retreated even further, looking around for a way out. And then I saw it. A small sign hidden among the trees that read, "The Way Back." My hope renewed, I rushed towards him, only to hear that laugh again. The little girl was standing on the side of the road, holding her doll and looking at me. Her empty eyes never let me out of her sight. "You're not leaving," she said, playing with a doll that slowly waved her hand in my direction. "There's no going back. There's only what's ahead." I could feel my mind almost succumbing to this nightmare, as if it were teetering on the thin line between reality and insanity. But then I saw behind the sign, somewhere far away, something was glowing. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was a light. And that was my only chance. I rushed forward without looking around, just ran. I heard voices and whispers chasing me, how they screamed my name, how they asked me to stop. I could feel the ground shaking under my feet, the trees swaying, trying to hold me. But I didn't stop. And here it is, the light has become closer. I saw the door. A huge, ancient wooden door with a brass handle. It stood in the middle of the forest, just in the air. I ran to them, and without thinking, I pressed the handle. The door opened with a long creak and I stepped inside, closing it behind me with all my might. Finding myself in the dark, I heard how steps, laughter and voices remained behind the door, separated from me by a thick wooden barrier. I sighed deeply, hoping that this was at least some temporary safety. I looked around to find myself standing in a small room lit only by a single candle on a table in the center. An old, worn diary lay on the table. I moved closer, feeling my every step echo dully in the room. I opened the diary and saw the word "Find" written in red ink on the first page. I started turning the pages. They were full of ominous notes, drawings, some strange symbols and maps. But on the last page was a message. It was all a trap. The only way out is to find the key. They've hidden it where the horror begins. And then the candle went out. The darkness came over me again, but now I felt that I was close to the answer, that somewhere in the middle of this nightmare was the key to my salvation. And I heard footsteps, heavy, quiet footsteps coming towards me from the darkness. "You're almost home," my brother's voice whispered, and I realized that even here in this room I was still not safe. They approached. I felt the walls begin to tighten again, and I knew I had to move on. I have to find the key. And I knew where to look. The darkness around me seemed alive. I could feel the air getting heavier, how with every breath it filled my lungs like thick smoke. My brother's words echoing in my head kept pulling me deeper into this madness. "You're almost home." But what did that mean? What is home in this place where every step leads to a new nightmare? I began to move forward, blindly stretching my arms out in front of me, trying to find some kind of foothold, something to help me understand where I was. And then my finger touched something cold and hard. Metal. I felt the object and realized it was a doorknob. I turned it and the door opened with a bone-chilling creak. Beyond the door I saw a long corridor lit by a faint flickering light that came from the lamps that hung on the walls like antique lanterns. They flickered as if they were about to go out. I slowly stepped into the hallway, feeling each step echo as if in a bottomless cave. I didn't know where I was going, but instinct told me that this was the only way forward. The walls of the corridor were covered with old yellowed wallpaper that had peeled off in places and exposed the brickwork beneath. The further I went, the more I felt something changing. I began to notice the writing on the walls. They were written in crooked, uneven letters, as if written by a hand that trembled with fear. "Don't trust them, everything is an illusion, you are already dead." I could feel a cold sweat running down my back. Somewhere ahead, soft but distinct sounds were heard, a whisper that grew louder and louder. I began to move faster, not knowing if I wanted to get to the source of these sounds or on the contrary to run away from them. But my legs themselves carried me forward. The flickering light grew brighter, and I noticed a door at the end of the corridor, from under which a soft yellow light seeped. I came closer and stopped. The whispers I heard were louder now. They were not words, but rather some kind of incomprehensible mumbling, as if the voices of many people were superimposed on each other. I felt my heart start to beat faster again, and I remembered the diary and the inscription, "The key is where the horror begins." Maybe this place? I touched the doorknob, but it felt like a red-hot iron. The hand withdrew on its own, but I knew I had to enter. Gathering all my will, I firmly grasped the handle a second time and turned it, and the door opened. I entered the room and immediately saw that it was an old office. The walls were hung with vintage maps and black and white photographs that seemed remarkably realistic. In the center of the room stood a table on which lay a pile of papers and an old typewriter. On the wall above the table hung a large black clock, the hands of which turned backwards. I went to the table and started looking through the papers. They were covered with notes consisting of numbers, place names and some strange symbols. My gaze stopped at one of the photos. It was a group photo of police officers, among whom I recognized my brother. But something was wrong. They all had no eyes. Only dark holes where the eyes should be, and on the faces, a numb smile that did not promise anything good. Suddenly the light in the room started to flicker. The clock on the wall rattled and suddenly stopped, showing exactly midnight. I heard a slight crack and the door slowly closed behind me. I rushed towards them, but something invisible pushed me back with force, throwing me back against the table. The door slammed and I heard the lock. I understood that now I have no way out. The air in the room became heavier, it seemed to be filled with thick smoke. I began to cough, my eyes searching for anything that could help me get out. And suddenly I saw it, the key. A small, old, rusty key that was lying under a pile of papers. It looked completely inconspicuous, but I knew right away that it was exactly the key the note was talking about. I grabbed the key and at the same moment I heard my brother's voice behind me. The choice is yours. Use it or stay with us forever. I turned around but didn't see anyone. Only a shadow that quickly dissolved in the air. I held the key tight, feeling its cold seep into my bones. He looked back at the door he ran to earlier. The heart was beating with a frantic rhythm. Was it the right key? Will he become my salvation? Suddenly, the floor beneath my feet began to vibrate, as if the room was beginning to wake up from sleep. The walls slowly moved closer to me and the whispers around me grew louder and louder. I knew I only had one chance. I got up, went to the door and put the key in the keyhole. The lock clicked, but the door did not open. I turned the key again and suddenly I heard a terrible scream that filled the room. It was not just a scream, but a broken, hopeless melody of suffering. The light began to fade as if it was being absorbed by some invisible force. I yanked open the door and heard something break behind it like steel breaking under pressure. The door opened and it was not light that opened before me, but a black abyss that beckoned me. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I took a step into the darkness and felt myself being picked up and pulled deep into the void that was waiting for me, ready to swallow me up. And at the last moment, I heard my brother's voice, which echoed loudly in space. Welcome home, *****.